My name is Ruth Calder, and I was 64 years old the night my own son laughed while his wife suggested I was taking up too much space. I was standing near the dining table, my fingers curled around the stem of a wine glass I hadn't finished. Above us, the chandelier cast a warm yellow glow, the kind meant to make a room feel successful and whole. It was my son Evan's promotion dinner, held in the house he shared with his wife, Melissa. Friends and co-workers filled the room, talking easily about careers, plans, and futures that felt neatly arranged. I hadn't planned to speak that night. I never did. I arrived early to help, instinctively moving through the kitchen, straightening chairs, wiping a counter already clean. When the caterer came in with trays of food, I stepped back without being asked, as if my presence might complicate things. By the time everyone sat down, I had taken my usual place at the edge of the room, close enough to hear everything, far enough not to be noticed. Melissa stood up first. She lifted her glass with practiced confidence and smiled at the room. She spoke about growth, about new chapters, about knowing when to make room for what comes next. Her voice was light, almost playful, when she laughed and said that some people understand when it's time to step back, while others don't realize how much space they take up. A few guests chuckled politely. I felt the words land, but I stayed still. Then Evan laughed too. It wasn't loud or mocking. It was quick, automatic, as if the moment required it. And that was when something inside me shifted, not sharply, but finally. I felt it settle, like a door closing that had been left open for years. I set my glass down and stood up. I didn't raise my voice. Yet the room grew quiet. I said that 10 days earlier. I had signed the papers on a house of my own, a large one, nearly 3,000 kilometers away. I told them I would be moving soon, and that I wouldn't be taking up anyone's space anymore. No one spoke. Evan's smile faded. Melissa froze mid-gesture. What they didn't know was that this decision hadn't been born in that moment. It had been forming quietly, over years of small silences, waiting only for me to finally say it out loud. That laughter didn't break me. It clarified everything, marking the exact moment I stopped waiting and began choosing myself instead, without apology. Long before that dinner, long before Melissa ever entered my life, I had learned how to make myself quiet. My husband died when our son Evan was still in elementary school. It was a workplace accident, sudden and painfully ordinary. One phone call split my life into before and after, and I understood almost immediately that grief would have to wait. There were bills that didn't pause for mourning, a mortgage that didn't soften because my world had collapsed, and a child who still needed breakfast, clean clothes, and the sense that tomorrow would arrive as expected. I took a clerical position at a public hospital not long after the funeral. The job wasn't impressive, but it was steady. And steadiness mattered more to me than anything else. I learned how to stretch a paycheck until it felt thin as paper, how to plan months ahead, how to keep my voice even while my hands trembled beneath the desk. I learned that if I stayed useful and undemanding, no one questioned why I was there. Evan grew up without ever realizing how much of that steadiness was built on restraint. I made sure he never felt the weight of what I carried. I showed up to school events, helped with homework late into the night, and smiled through exhaustion so convincingly that even I began to believe it. When he left for college, I waved until his car disappeared and cried only after the street went quiet again. He built a respectable career and married Melissa a few years later. She was confident in a way I had never been, comfortable taking up space, comfortable being heard. I told myself that was a good thing. I reminded myself that my role had changed, that this was the season of stepping back. I learned her routines the way one learns a new language, carefully, trying not to sound out of place. when Melissa lost a pregnancy early in their marriage. Evan called me late one night and asked if I could stay for a while, just until things settled down. I packed a small suitcase and told myself it was temporary. I wanted to help. I always had. At first, no one said anything unkind. Nothing needed to be said. I folded laundry that wasn't mine and made dinners that fit their schedules. I labeled leftovers so nothing would be wasted. When guests came over, I cleared plates before anyone asked. When Melissa rested, I kept the house quiet. When Evan came home late, I made sure the porch light was on. Weeks passed, then months, without anyone acknowledging the change. My room slowly filled with boxes that weren't mine. Baby furniture appeared and stayed, untouched. My calendar bent around theirs without discussion. If plans conflicted, mine were the ones that moved. Melissa never raised her voice. She didn't have to. She spoke in suggestions that felt like conclusions. It would be easier if I handled dinner earlier. It might help if I stayed out of the way during video meetings. It would probably be better if I used the back bathroom. None of it sounded cruel. All of it was final. Evan noticed just enough to avoid it. When I tried to explain once, carefully, he smiled in that familiar way and asked why everything had to be a problem. He said we were all under stress and that things would smooth out on their own. I nodded, because nodding had always kept the peace. After that, I stopped trying to explain. Instead, I became efficient, invisible. I woke early and slept lightly. I learned the sound of Melissa's footsteps so I could move before she entered a room. I learned how to listen without reacting, how to be present without being seen. I learned how to disappear while still being useful. What hurt wasn't the work. It was the quiet agreement that this was simply where I belonged now. No one asked if I was comfortable. No one asked how long I planned to stay. The assumptions settled around me like dust, thin but everywhere. Around that time, I began to notice how often my name went unused. Conversations moved around me as if I were part of the furniture. Decisions were made in the same room without including me, even when they shaped my days. I wasn't angry so much as unsettled, because once you notice that kind of absence, it becomes impossible to unsee. I told myself this was temporary, that once life felt lighter for them, I would quietly return to my own routines. But the days kept stacking up, and no one mentioned an end date. When I thought about leaving, I realized no one had asked me to stay either. By the time Evan's promotion dinner was announced, I already understood my role. I would help. I would stand aside. I would not expect to be seen. I just hadn't admitted yet that silence, too, is a choice. I can't point to a single moment when I decided to leave. It wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no slammed door, no night spent crying on the bathroom floor. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways, more permanent. It began the morning I realized I had stopped expecting things to change. Melissa was already awake, moving through the kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear. She nodded at me without breaking her conversation. Evan had left early for work. The house felt busy and empty at the same time. I stood there for a moment, holding my mug, waiting for instructions that never came. That was when it struck me how much of my life had shifted into a state of waiting. Waiting to be needed, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting for the right moment to matter again. I finished my coffee, washed the mug, and went back to my room. Not my old bedroom, but the smaller one at the end of the hall, the one that had slowly become storage for everything that didn't fit elsewhere. I sat on the edge of the bed and felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity settle over me. If no one was going to decide what came next for me, I didn't announce anything. I didn't threaten to leave or ask for permission. I simply began paying attention to my finances, to my time, to the quiet corners of my life I had neglected out of habit. I pulled out folders I hadn't opened in years, old bank statements, retirement paperwork from the hospital, notes I had scribbled long ago and never revisited. I made appointments at the community center and sat through workshops on budgeting and long-term planning, surrounded by people my age who had also realized, perhaps too late, that waiting had a cost. There was nothing reckless about it. I didn't gamble. I didn't chase sudden wealth. I did what I had always done best. I planned carefully. I adjusted expectations. I built something slowly, piece by piece, without drawing attention to myself, at home. Nothing changed on the surface. I still cooked when needed. I still stepped aside when Melissa's schedule took priority. Evan still thanked me in passing, always distracted, always in motion. No one noticed that I had stopped rearranging my days around theirs quite so completely. When Melissa mentioned needing the room I was in for additional storage, I nodded and began packing my things more deliberately. When Evan talked about future plans that didn't include me, I listened without interrupting. I had learned that clarity doesn't need an audience. The first time I spoke to a real estate agent, my hands shook. Not from fear, but from the strange feeling of doing something entirely for myself. I told her what I wanted in simple terms. Quiet. Space. Somewhere that felt like a beginning rather than a compromise. She asked why I was moving. I said I was ready. That seemed to satisfy her. The house I eventually chose wasn't impulsive. It wasn't hidden away or wildly impractical. It was simply large enough to remind me that I didn't need to fold myself smaller to fit. It sat in a quiet coastal town, far enough away that no one could drop by unannounced, close enough to the water that the air felt different when I breathed it in. I visited alone. I walked through empty rooms and imagined nothing extravagant. A chair by a window, a table where I could eat without rushing. Walls that wouldn't need to make room for someone else's plans. Signing the papers felt surreal, not triumphant, just steady. Like crossing a line I hadn't known I was allowed to draw. Back at Evan's house, life continued as usual. Melissa talked about reorganizing. Evan talked about work. No one asked about my plans. I booked movers quietly. I sorted through what I would take and what I would leave behind. Years of making do had taught me how little I truly needed. The night of the promotion dinner arrived without warning, as if time had decided not to slow down for anyone. I put on a simple dress and fixed my hair the way I always had, careful not to look like I was trying too hard. I told myself I was just there to support my son. That was still true. But something in me had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping for permission or recognition. I was standing on the edge of a life that belonged to me, whether anyone noticed or not. As I stepped into the dining room and took my place near the wall, I already knew that whatever happened that night, I would not be staying. I just didn't yet know how clearly everyone else would see it. The house looked different that night, dressed up in a way that felt almost theatrical. Extra lighting softened the corners. The table was set more carefully than usual, polished glasses lined up with intention. Someone had chosen flowers that didn't shed petals, as if even mess had been edited out of the evening. I arrived early, out of habit. The caterer was already there, moving efficiently through the kitchen. I offered to help, then stopped myself halfway through the sentence and stepped aside instead. Old instincts don't disappear quickly, but they do hesitate when you stop feeding them. Guests began to arrive, co-workers, friends, people who spoke easily about promotions and long-term plans. Evan moved through the room with a confidence I recognized and admired. He looked comfortable in his life, settled in a way that made me proud and, unexpectedly, distant. Melissa greeted everyone with ease. She knew where to stand, when to laugh, how to keep the room angled toward her. When she passed by me, she smiled and touched my arm briefly, a gesture that felt more like punctuation than affection. Dinner was served without incident. Conversation rose and fell around the table. I listened more than I spoke, the way I always had. No one asked about my days or my plans. That, too, felt familiar. When the plates were cleared and fresh glasses poured, Melissa stood up. She tapped her spoon lightly against her glass and waited for the room to quiet. Evan looked up at her with an expression that suggested pride and relief, as if the night was unfolding exactly as planned. She spoke about ambition and balance, about how important it was to recognize when life was changing. Her voice carried easily, practiced but not forced. Then she laughed softly and said that growth required making room, and that while some people understood when to step back, others didn't realize how much space they took up. The laughter that followed was scattered, uncertain. Some people glanced at one another, unsure. And then Evan laughed. It was brief, unthinking, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it landed with a weight I hadn't anticipated. In that instant, something I had been holding on to for years finally let go. Not anger, not heartbreak, something closer to clarity. I understood then that silence, repeated often enough, becomes agreement, and that Evan's laughter wasn't betrayal born of cruelty, but of convenience. I stood up before I could talk myself out of it. I didn't feel rushed. I didn't feel shaky. I felt strangely composed, as if my body had been rehearsing this moment without my awareness. The room quieted, more out of confusion than respect. I said I had something to share. My voice sounded calm to my own ears. I told them that 10 days earlier, I had signed the papers on a house of my own, a large one, far away, nearly 3,000 kilometers from where we were standing. I said I would be moving soon, and that I wouldn't be taking up anyone's space anymore. No one interrupted me. Evan's smile faded slowly, replaced by something uncertain. Melissa's hand remained lifted in the air, her glass untouched. I didn't explain myself further. I didn't justify the decision or soften it with humor. I simply said what was true. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence felt heavy, but it didn't frighten me. I had lived with silence long enough to know its shape. Melissa recovered first. She laughed lightly and said she hadn't meant anything by her comment, that it was just a joke. Evan looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally said my name. I nodded. Not in forgiveness, not in dismissal, just acknowledgement. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. Someone suggested dessert. Someone else tried to change the subject. I stayed long enough to be polite, then gathered my coat. No one stopped me as I left. In the quiet of my car, I sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel, listening to the engine idle. I expected to feel regret, or grief, or doubt. Instead, I felt settled. By the time I pulled into the driveway later that night, I knew I wouldn't be persuaded to stay. The laughter had done its work. It had stripped away the last excuse I had been using to delay my own life. Inside the house, everything was quiet. Evan and Melissa were still out. I walked down the hallway to my room, the small one at the end, and looked around with new eyes. It no longer felt like a place I was waiting in. It felt like somewhere I had already outgrown. I moved out exactly 10 days later, just as I had said. There was no argument, no dramatic goodbye, no moment where anyone tried to stop me. I packed slowly, deliberately, choosing what to take and what to leave behind. Years of living carefully had taught me that most things were easier to let go of than people imagined. The movers arrived early that morning. Their voices echoed softly through the house as they carried boxes down the hallway. Evan stood near the front door, watching without speaking. Melissa stayed in the kitchen, her back turned, her voice low as she spoke on the phone. No one asked where I was going. No one asked if I was sure. That, more than anything, confirmed I was doing the right thing. The drive to my new home felt longer than the map suggested. Mile after mile passed beneath my tires, giving me time to think. Though I found my mind strangely calm. I wasn't replaying the dinner or the laughter anymore. That moment had already settled into place, like a final period at the end of a sentence. When I arrived, the house was quiet and empty, sunlight spilling through the windows onto bare floors. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before stepping inside, listening to the sound of my own breathing. There was no rush to fill the space. It didn't feel lonely. It felt open. The first weeks unfolded gently. I learned the rhythms of the small coastal town, the best hours to walk near the water, the cafe where no one hurried me out of my seat. I planted rose bushes along the fence, kneeling in the soil each morning, my hands steady, my thoughts unburdened. I signed up for a painting class at the community center and discovered I liked the way acrylic paint layered slowly, each stroke building on the last. For the first time in decades, my days belonged entirely to me. Evan called after a few weeks. His voice sounded different, quieter, as if he had been forced to listen to himself for the first time. He told me Melissa had moved out not long after I left. He said work had become unstable, that a company restructuring had cost him his position. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't blame me either. I listened. That was all he seemed to need at first. A month later, he came to see me. He stood on my porch holding a small bag, uncertain, like someone unsure of the rules in a place he hadn't earned yet. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight warming the room. He told me he had started therapy. He spoke slowly, carefully, about how often he had chosen silence because it was easier than confrontation, how laughter had once felt harmless until he understood what it cost. He apologized without rushing, without excuses. I didn't forgive him immediately. I didn't need to. I told him I loved him and that I was proud of him for doing the work, but that I would not be returning to the life I had left behind. I explained that our relationship would have to exist differently now, with boundaries that protected us both. He nodded. This time, he understood. Melissa never came. I heard about her only in fragments, through careful updates Evan offered without prompting. I wished her well, quietly, from a distance that felt necessary. Some relationships, I had learned, were healthier when allowed to remain unfinished. As the months passed, my life grew fuller in ways I hadn't expected. I hosted neighbors for simple dinners, nothing elaborate, just good food and unhurried conversation. I painted often, filling canvases with color until one afternoon I finished a piece that surprised me. A phoenix, rising against a deep blue background, its wings mid-motion. I hung it in the hallway, not as a symbol for anyone else, but as a reminder to myself. In the evenings, I sat outside and listened to the ocean. The sound was steady, unchanging, and it grounded me. I thought about how long I had waited to be invited into my own life, how easily patience had turned into erasure, how silence, repeated often enough, had begun to feel like obligation. Leaving hadn't been an act of anger or revenge. It had been an act of recognition. I still speak to my son. Our relationship is slower now, more deliberate. It rests on conversation instead of assumption, on presence instead of convenience. I no longer step aside automatically. I no longer shrink to fit the space someone else decides I deserve. What I learned, later than I should have, but still in time, is that space isn't something you ask for politely. It's something you claim by choosing yourself when no one else will. And in the quiet of my own home, with the ocean steady in the distance and my roses beginning to bloom, I finally understood that leaving wasn't the end of my story. It was the moment I began living it on my own terms.